Before we go into one of the most controversial financial events in American history, you need to understand the world that these five bankers inhabited. The year was 1907, and Wall Street was not just a place where rich people gambled with money. It was essentially a shadow government. There was no Federal Reserve System yet. There was no safety net. There was no central bank. When the wealthy financiers of New York City decided something needed to happen, it happened. When they decided something needed to fail, it failed. The United States economy had been booming since the mid-1890s, and by 1906 everyone was feeling good about their financial future. People were investing in stocks like never before. Banks were lending money freely. Trust companies, think of them as the less regulated cousins of banks, were exploding in popularity because they offered higher interest rates on deposits. These trust companies were the shadow banks of their day, operating just outside the regulatory framework that governed traditional banks. But here is the thing that most people do not realize. Several of the most powerful bankers in New York held seats on the boards of these trust companies while simultaneously running their own competing banks. This created a tangled web of conflicting interests that would make a modern-day prosecutor weep with joy. By 1906, though, the European banks were getting nervous. Gold was flowing out of European vaults and into American hands at an alarming rate. The Bank of England, the most prestigious financial institution in the world at the time, panicked and raised its interest rates dramatically. This was a signal to the rest of the world that European money was getting tight. American investors got nervous too. When investors get nervous, they sell. The stock market peaked in 1906 and then began a steady decline. By May 1907, the economy officially entered recession. On top of all this, the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 had devastated the entire Pacific coast, and vast amounts of gold and capital had to be redirected there to rebuild. The money supply was getting tighter by the week. Farmers were about to harvest their crops and would need credit to move grain east. Interest rates for borrowing money shot up into the stratosphere. Anyone who owed money was starting to feel the squeeze. Fast forward to October 1907, and we need to meet the men who would unknowingly, or knowingly, depending on who you ask, light the fuse. Enter F. Augustus Heinze, a copper magnate from Butte, Montana, who had made a fortune in mining. Heinze moved to New York City in 1906 and quickly became best friends with Charles W. Morse, a notorious Wall Street operator who had actually made his fortune by cornering New York City's ice market at one point. These two weren't exactly altar boys. They represented a new breed of speculator who was willing to take enormous risks to get rich quickly. Heinze had two brothers, Otto and Arthur. Together with Morse, the four of them controlled a significant stake in the United Copper Company, a mining outfit of moderate importance. But Heinze and Morse did something that speculators have done for centuries. They tried to corner the market. They bought up shares aggressively, betting that the price would skyrocket. They financed these purchases using margin, which means they borrowed most of the money they needed to buy the stock. If the stock price went up, they would make an enormous profit. If it went down, they would lose everything, and the banks that lent them the money would lose too. Here is where it gets even more interesting. Otto Heinze devised a scheme based on the assumption that they already controlled a majority of United Copper stock. He believed that short sellers, speculators betting that the stock price would fall, had already sold millions of shares that they did not own, planning to buy them back cheaper later. If the Heinzes could corner most of the available shares, they figured the short sellers would have no choice but to buy at whatever price Heinze and Morse demanded. This was textbook market manipulation. But on October 16th, 1907, the scheme collapsed. The shares they thought they controlled were not actually theirs. They could not deliver on their promises to buy back shares. When word got out that the Heinze-Morse scheme was falling apart, panic swept through the financial district. People realized that banks that had lent money to this scheme were about to lose enormous sums. Which banks were those? The ones where Heinze and Morse held the most power. Mercantile National Bank, where Heinze was president, and the National Bank of North America, where Morse ran operations. This is where the story gets really murky, and where the five bankers come into focus. Because immediately after the Heinze-Morse scheme collapsed, runs did not just happen at their banks. They cascaded through the entire New York financial system in a way that seemed almost coordinated. But to understand how, you need to know who these five bankers were and what they stood to gain. The undisputed leader was J.P. Morgan, the 70-year-old titan of American finance. Morgan had engineered the creation of U.S. Steel, General Electric, American Telephone and Telegraph, and dozens of other giant corporations. He was essentially the closest thing America had to a central banker. When Morgan spoke, the presidents listened. When Morgan acted, Wall Street followed. Working alongside Morgan was George F. Baker, the president of First National Bank of New York. These two men had been friends for decades and understood each other perfectly, according to contemporary accounts. Baker was respected across the financial community as a brilliant strategist and an absolutely ruthless competitor. Next was James Stillman, president of National City Bank of New York, which would later become Citibank. Stillman was technically a rival to both Morgan and Baker for securities underwriting contracts. But despite the competition, all three men maintained relationships built on mutual respect. The fourth figure in this inner circle was Benjamin Strong, the young secretary of Bankers Trust Company, who would later become president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Strong was perhaps the most important person in terms of logistics. He was the one tasked with actually investigating which banks could be saved and which should be left to fail. He had the information. He had the power to make recommendations. And most importantly, he had control over who lived and who died in the financial world. The fifth person who deserves a spot in this story is harder to pin down, but it is arguably John D. Rockefeller, the oil monopolist who was sitting on absolutely vast sums of cash. Rockefeller did not control a bank the way the others did, but he had something just as valuable: unlimited capital. He would emerge during the panic to deploy $10 million in strategic places that Morgan pointed him toward. Whether this was coordination or just opportunism is exactly the question that would plague historians for over a century. Here is something important that almost everyone gets wrong about 1907. The system was not just vulnerable because of bad luck or the Heinze-Morse scheme. The system was vulnerable because it had been deliberately designed to concentrate power in the hands of a few men. And once you understand that, everything that follows starts to look less like a financial crisis and more like a power play. Trust companies were barely regulated, which meant they could take on enormous risks without anyone watching. They could borrow money at short-term rates and lend it out long-term, which is a recipe for disaster in a liquidity crunch. But more importantly, the same bankers who ran the major banks also had seats on the boards of multiple trust companies. So when trust companies got into trouble, the banker directors did not have to choose between saving their competitors and protecting their own institutions. They could strategically pick which trust company lived and which one died based on their own financial interests. The network of interlocking directorates was absolutely stunning. Officers from Morgan's Bank sat on the boards of 112 corporations with a total value of $22.5 billion. For context, the entire New York Stock Exchange at that time was only worth about $26.5 billion. This was not just concentration of power. This was near monopoly. And everyone in New York knew it. On October 17, 1907, after the Heinze-Morse scheme fell apart, runs began on the banks where Heinze and Morse had influence. They failed quickly. But here is the critical moment. The panic could have stopped there. The general public did not have massive deposits in Mercantile National Bank or the National Bank of North America. Those were primarily banks for financial professionals and wealthy speculators. But it did not stop. Instead, the panic spread to trust companies that had virtually nothing to do with Heinze and Morse. The Knickerbocker Trust Company was the third largest trust in New York City, and technically it was connected to the mess through its president, Charles Barney, who had maintained relationships with Heinze. On October 18th, a run began on Knickerbocker. It spread with the speed of a wildfire. This is where J.P. Morgan's actions become absolutely crucial to understanding whether this panic was engineered or merely exploited. Morgan was in Richmond, Virginia, attending a church convention when he heard about Knickerbocker's problems. He immediately came back to New York and arrived on Sunday, October 20th. The very first thing he did was call a meeting at his mansion on 34th Street. He assembled George Baker, James Stillman, Treasury Secretary George Cortelyou, Benjamin Strong, and other top financiers. Here is what happened next. Morgan formed committees to evaluate which banks could be saved and which should be left to fail. Benjamin Strong was assigned to evaluate the assets of troubled institutions. Strong's job was to walk into a bank, examine the books in a few hours, and make a recommendation to Morgan. Morgan would then decide whether to save the bank or let it collapse. This gave Morgan and his inner circle the power to essentially resurrect or kill any financial institution in New York. On October 21st, Strong reported that he could not properly evaluate Knickerbocker's financial condition in the time available. Morgan's response was to refuse to aid the trust. This single decision kept other institutions from offering substantial assistance as well. Once it became clear that the mighty J.P. Morgan was not going to save Knickerbocker, every depositor immediately understood that the game was over. They ran to withdraw their money. The bank failed. And the panic intensified. But get this, when Strong evaluated the Trust Company of America, which was probably connected to Morgan's interests through multiple directors, he reported that it was basically sound and deserved assistance. Morgan channeled $3 million to the Trust Company of America just before closing time, allowing it to reopen the next day with the public's confidence restored. The selectivity is striking. Knickerbocker, which had virtually no ties to Morgan's network, was allowed to fail. The Trust Company of America, which was deeply connected to Morgan's interests, was saved. And this pattern repeated itself throughout the panic. Banks and trusts that had been competing with Morgan's institutions, or that were not part of his network, were left to collapse. Banks and trusts that were part of the Morgan ecosystem were given emergency funding. The most famous story from the entire panic concerns an event that happened on October 23, 1907. Morgan invited approximately 120 bank and trust company presidents to his personal library. He had a proposal for them. The solvent trusts would need to collectively provide $25 million to save the weaker institutions. The trust presidents did not like this idea, they argued. They refused. So Morgan, at this point 70 years old, locked the library doors and pocketed the key. He informed the assembled bankers that nobody was leaving until they came to an agreement. As the hours passed, and the bankers realized Morgan was not bluffing, they began to cave. Around 4:45 in the morning, the unofficial leader of the Trust Company Group signed the agreement. The rest quickly followed. Having secured their submission, Morgan allowed the bankers to go home. This moment has been interpreted in two completely different ways. One interpretation is that Morgan was a patriot who was willing to use tough tactics to save the financial system and prevent a complete economic collapse. The other interpretation is that Morgan was a mob boss who had essentially kidnapped a room full of financial executives to force them to vote for a solution that would primarily benefit his own interests. The fact that historians still debate this more than a century later tells you something important. As the panic raged throughout October and early November of 1907, Morgan orchestrated what many believe to be a deliberate act of corporate consolidation disguised as crisis management. There was a major brokerage firm called Moore and Schley that had borrowed heavily using Tennessee coal, iron, and railroad company stock as collateral. As the market crashed, the value of that stock plummeted. Moore and Schley faced collapse, which would have sent shockwaves through the entire system. Morgan's solution was this. He arranged for his United States Steel Company to purchase Tennessee coal, iron, and railroad, taking Moore and Schley's debt problems off their hands. But here is the thing. This acquisition gave United States Steel a virtual monopoly on American steel production. It was exactly the kind of consolidation that should have triggered antitrust action. So Morgan did something remarkable. He had his allies call President Theodore Roosevelt on a Saturday evening and inform him that without this merger, the entire financial system would collapse on Monday. Roosevelt, believing he was saving the economy, gave his blessing. Morgan got his monopoly. Competitors were eliminated. And afterwards, when people asked whether Morgan had deliberately orchestrated the panic to create an opportunity for consolidation, Morgan could always point to Roosevelt's approval and say he was just saving the country. By 1908, a lot of people were asking uncomfortable questions. The progressive movement was gaining momentum. Populist politicians were demanding answers. How could a single man and his small circle of allies have such enormous power over the entire financial system? Why had some banks been saved while others were allowed to collapse? Why had competitors of Morgan's institutions been deliberately starved of assistance? In 1912, Congressman Arsen Peugeot of Louisiana convened a special committee to investigate what they called the Money Trust, essentially a cartel of the most powerful New York bankers who were using their control of credit to manipulate markets and consolidate corporate power. The Peugeot Committee examined records, testimony, and the flow of money during the panic. Their conclusion was remarkable. They unanimously determined that a small cartel of financiers, namely J.P. Morgan and a few other of New York's most powerful bankers, had gained consolidated control of numerous industries. Moreover, they had used the panic of 1907 to monopolize those industries through the abuse of public trust. The committee concluded that Morgan, Baker, Stillman, and their respective financial institutions had systematically picked which institutions would survive and which would fail based on whether those institutions represented competition or complementary interests. Did the Peugeot Committee prove that Morgan and his allies deliberately engineered the panic? No, not directly. But what they did show was that Morgan and his circle had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to exploit a financial crisis for their own benefit. And perhaps most damning, they showed that Morgan had used his control over information, his investigators, his committees, and his private evaluations to determine which institutions lived or died purely based on his financial interests. So the question becomes this: did Morgan and his circle actually engineer the panic, or did they simply exploit it? This is where we need to separate what we know from what is purely speculation. What we know is this: Morgan clearly had advanced knowledge that a financial crisis was coming. Banker Jacob Schiff of Kuhn, Loeb and Company had warned the financial community in early 1907 that a severe money panic was inevitable without a central bank. Morgan knew about tight monetary conditions. He knew the system was vulnerable. He knew that a crisis would give tremendous power to whoever could provide liquidity. What we also know is this: Morgan and his allies used their control over emergency lending to systematically destroy competitors and strengthen their own position. They allowed some banks to fail that they might have been able to save. They saved other banks that might have failed if Morgan had not intervened. Their actions followed a clear pattern of consolidating power. What we do not know is whether Morgan deliberately tipped the system into panic, or whether he simply positioned himself to exploit a panic he knew was coming. There is a huge difference between engineering a crisis and positioning yourself to benefit from one you can see approaching. The conspiracy theory that Morgan engineered the panic entirely from scratch does not really hold up under scrutiny. The Heinze-Morse scheme was genuinely reckless speculation that would have caused problems regardless. The tight monetary conditions were real. The California earthquake really did drain gold from the system. Morgan could not have orchestrated all of that. But the theory that Morgan deliberately allowed the panic to spread from small speculators to the broader financial system, that he allowed it to metastasize through trust companies in a way that he could have prevented, is actually supported by substantial evidence. If the goal was to consolidate power, the best way to do it would have been exactly what Morgan did. Allow the system to panic just enough that people were desperate for his help, but not so much that it completely collapsed. Then, once everyone was desperate, he could pick which institutions survived and which ones did not. Here is the ironic twist that makes this entire story even more interesting. The panic of 1907 was so traumatic that Congress decided the country needed a central bank to prevent this from happening again. Senator Nelson Aldrich convened a National Monetary Commission to study the issue. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act, and America's first official central bank came into existence. But guess who became the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York? Benjamin Strong, the man who had been Morgan's chief investigator during the panic, the man who decided which banks were worthy of assistance, the man who had systematically starved competitors of emergency funding. Strong had learned the lessons of 1907 intimately, and now he had the official power of a central bank behind him. The net result of the panic was exactly what Morgan would have wanted. United States Steel achieved near monopoly status. The competing trust companies had been devastated. Morgan's bank's influence over the financial system had been permanently entrenched, and a formal central bank had been created that was staffed with people who had learned the game from Morgan himself. Whether Morgan engineered the panic or simply exploited it brilliantly, he certainly won. The panic of 1907 teaches us something fundamental about financial systems. Concentrated power is the real danger. It is not bad luck. It is not random market movements. It is concentrated power in the hands of a small number of people who have both the motive and the means to manipulate markets for their own benefit. The five bankers, Morgan, Baker, Stillman, Strong, and Rockefeller, did not necessarily wake up on October 15, 1907, and decide they were going to crash the financial system. But they operated in a system with no central regulation, no transparency, and no checks on their power. When a crisis emerged, they had the ability to decide unilaterally which institutions would be saved and which would be destroyed. And they used that power in ways that systematically benefited themselves and their allies. More than a century later, we still do not have complete transparency into how these decisions were made. We do not know what private conversations took place in Morgan's mansion. We do not know what deals were made that do not appear in the historical record. What we do know is that the outcome was remarkably beneficial to the most powerful bankers and remarkably harmful to their competitors. That is the real story of 1907. It was not about five bankers deliberately engineering a panic to cause suffering and consolidate power, though some people genuinely believed that at the time. It was about 5 bankers operating in a system with virtually no regulation, no transparency, and no limits on their power, and then using that power to ensure that when a crisis emerged, they would be the winners, and everyone else would be the losers. And that, as it turns out, was already plenty efficient at concentrating wealth and power. The panic of 1907 fundamentally changed American financial history, but perhaps not in the way it was supposed to. It led to the creation of the Federal Reserve System, which was designed to prevent financial panics and protect the broader economy. But it also entrenched the power of the elite financial class by giving them an official institution that they could influence and control. Whether that was exactly what Morgan hoped for when he locked the doors of his library at 4:45 in the morning remains a question we will probably never fully answer.